created a warm and engaging narrative for your podcast. Consider Great Tell Me as a suggestion that combines an upbeat and inviting spirit without any background music. Welcome to Tangelic Talks, your go-to podcast from Tangelic, where we dive into the vibrant world of clean energy, development, sustainability, and climate change in Africa. We bring you inspiring stories, insightful discussions, and groundbreaking innovations from the continent making waves in the global community. Tune in and join the conversation toward a brighter, greener future. Let's get started.
Welcome to Tangelic Talks, a podcast at the intersection of energy, equity, and empowerment with just your host, Jensen Cummings, today, because we have a very special episode we are calling Powering the Future, Energy Access, Critical Minerals, and the Degrowth Dilemma. It's our first panel discussion. We're going to be joined by Dr. Tam Kemabonta, Madison Harris, and our own Victoria Cornelio is going to be on the panel. We're excited about that. Our panelists are each future leaders in these spaces that I just mentioned. They're going to inherit the state of things from previous generations. And so what I was interested in hearing from them is how they're viewing the challenges and potential opportunities that lay ahead. Where is their thinking? Where are the hopes, the dreams, the joys, the pains that they're feeling in this moment as they look into the future within their own works and the global state. So let me just properly introduce our panelists. First up, Dr. Tam Kemabonta is an energy systems specialist focused on institutions, regulation, and electricity markets across sub-Saharan Africa and North America. He is also the founder of Entric, an energy transition infrastructure company bringing clean power to underserved communities. Next up, Madison Harris is working and studying at Arizona State University as she completes a Master's of Sustainability Solutions degree. Her academic interests include the trade-offs and negative consequences associated with the technological innovations and the transition toward renewable energy. Finally, Victoria Cornelio, on top of her role at Tangelic, also works for an environmental think tank focused on clean energy and water, also serves as a communications officer for a children's charity. Victoria has a background in politics and a master's degree specializing in the socio-political dimensions of climate change. Thanks to all three of you for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. As I mentioned, we're going to be talking about these three areas: clean energy, access. We're going to be talking about critical minerals, and we're going to be talking about some of the things that lay ahead for degrowth dilemma and what's happening there. So let's start with energy access. So before we can talk about energy transition, we need to spotlight the need for improving energy access. As we transition to cleaner energy, how do we ensure equitable access? Are marginalized and developing regions being overlooked? Dr. Kemabonta, I want to start with you here. This is kind of your field, your area. So give us your first thoughts, your overview when you're thinking about energy access.
Great. Thanks for having me on the show. Really appreciate being here. As you mentioned, there are probably about 700 million people in the world today who don't have access to electricity. And we all know that electricity makes your life a lot easier. So for example, you can wash your clothes, you can cook your food, and you can read a book at the same time. And you can only do those three things largely because of electricity, And thinking about some of the solutions that we need to address a lot of the people, or to address the energy needs of people who currently live in energy poverty, I think a major thing we need to focus on is affordability, which I think can come through the aspect of addressing some of the regulatory structures within these countries. So, for example, a major utility can charge cost-reflective tariffs within a country. They're not able to recoup their costs back, and they're not able to build out larger systems to address those who don't have access, which is a major problem. So many of the countries that currently experience energy poverty, who are largely located in sub-Saharan Africa, have liquidity crisis within their energy power sectors. So they can't even address some of the customers they already have. And now they need to extend the grid to address some of the other customers that are not connected to the grid. So those who actually live in energy poverty. Hence, thinking about some of the solutions that we've been looking at is what are the local frameworks by which you can think of planning energy systems? How do we think about going into communities that don't have access, coming up with solutions that address affordability, that creates reliable access, and to some extent is relatively clean. So hence doesn't cause, at least not um, a direct health hazard to some of these people. In some cases they use gasoline generators, and they put these generators in very, very enclosed spaces that could lead to carbon monoxide poisoning, for example. So how do we think about the solutions, and how do we come up with a way to make it affordable? And that's largely what I've been focusing on for the past couple of years. And I think that a major way to think about it is if you can create a regulatory structure that allows developers come up with solutions with the communities where this is necessary, because communities are different from one another. Some communities experience some level of political instability and some don't. So this always has to be part of the planning process to bring electricity to these people. Just to wrap that up real quickly. So solutions should focus on affordability, should focus on reliability, and should focus on safety, safety looking at the environmental aspects of it. Um, and if you can address that, then you can think about solutions that can help these communities that don't have access to electricity.
Appreciate that. I like how you put an end cap on that as well, because that's usually my job. That was excellently done. Appreciate that. Madison, I'm interested from your perspective. I think technology, thinking about the different types of clean energy, thinking of microgrids, some of these types of things. Where does your head go when I say that, when I frame it like that, as far as uh, the places that you want to see some attention and some energy spent on creating some solutions?
Yeah, for sure. So, because my master's program is sustainability solutions, we often try to, come up with solutions to some of these big problems. And we often find in sustainability and in most fields, there's trade offs. So, while technology can be a solution in some cases to some of these challenges of energy access and renewable energy transitions, it can also have some negative impacts as well. I'm really interested in looking into the trade-offs when it comes to sourcing minerals or something like AI or big tech, and what do data centers do to our energy grid, and what does that increasing demand do to energy reliability and energy equity? There's some interesting cases, at least in the US, of injustice happening and energy justice challenges when natural disasters happen, because there's so much energy reliance on the tech sector. And when it comes to smaller nations, I think microgrids can be a great solution, particularly for island nations, because it's expensive to ship in oil and gas. And renewable energy is becoming a increasingly affordable option, especially in terms of fuel, because there's no additional marginal cost for fuel if you're using something like the sun or wind, whereas you can't say that for oil and gas. But again, there's trade-offs to everything, and so yeah, you have to really look at these challenges with a systems perspective, and also consider social economic implications. And when it comes to economic implications, financing is a big challenge, especially when we consider that uh, these developing nations often face the brunt of climate change. And so they're often having to respond to immediate impacts like flooding or sea level rise. And they might not necessarily have the financial means to prioritize sustainability in the long term because they're busy paying off more immediate concerns.
Can you say more on the financing side? I think that's interesting, right? We hear things about carbon credits, I think is a big kind of buzzword right now that I don't know was maybe potentially meant to be something that could help support some of these underserved communities. Now it feels like it might be a little bit extractive in its potential. How do you see some of the ways that financing can meet these needs and these challenges?
Yeah, so there's lots of pretty unique funding mechanisms that could be used. There's different types of bonds, different types of grants. There's lots of examples. And one resource that I like to refer to is from the World Economic Forum. They have this kind of playbook of solutions to kind of mobilize energy transitions. And a lot of them rely on, yeah, like debt financing, bonds, equity financing, lots of different mechanisms that can be used. And I like to say I prefer the ones that don't generate debt and don't have to be paid back, because ultimately, when you look at the problem holistically, it's the developed nations that are predominantly causing climate change historically and currently. So I don't think it's fair to then look at the countries that are facing the brunt of climate change and say, hey, why are you using coal? Why you have to use renewable energy? You have to find a way to pay for it. That just seems ethically unfair to me.
That makes sense. All right, Victoria, for you, energy justice, I think was touched on several times by Dr. Kemabonta and Madison as well. And I know a space that you're very passionate about. So let's talk about that a little bit. How kind of the disparity between wealthy nations and underserved communities, how do we bridge that gap? Where is the disconnect there?
I mean, I think it ties back to something Madison was saying about finance. And finance always comes up. The COP in Brazil this year is all about sorting out this climate finance, tweaks that we need to get reparations and adaptation measures and things like that. So it is a big one. But I think if we started calling these loans grants, I think that would automatically start shifting the balance a little bit, because a loan implies that you will be able to pay it back. A grant is something that you give and you forget about it. And like Madison said, when you have a community that is being hit every which way and cannot prioritize necessarily unsustainable long-term projects because there's immediate needs right now, then you're asking for a bit too much to expect for that to be paid back. And I think there's also something about with microgrids or community ownership models, things like having these things given back to the community, but also that the community as a project is hands on getting these, for example, off-grid renewable solar microgrids, things like that. You train the community to be able to use it themselves. It's moving away from coming in and giving solutions and actually equipping communities to sustain those solutions, because then you fall into this trap of dependency that we've been seeing since, colonialism. And it's something that is really hard for us to move away from, because there is this misconception, which there is a reason there is this misconception, but there is this thing where the knowledge is up here and we have to transfer it over there, or the resources are here and we have to give them over there. And then it means that there is never that feedback loop of, well, now that we've given them over there, they can stay over there. No, we're expecting things to just keep running without that intersection. And just doesn't work, as we can see. These things just don't work. And I think just transition frameworks, especially, lack that nuance.
Appreciate that. This is a complicated subject, and one of the things that Tangelic is really focused on as well. So I appreciate the input on this, because it continues to allow us as an organization and as a think tank of individuals to be able to bring solutions to the table. And that's why we have these conversations. That's why this panel is so important, because for better or worse, we're leaving you with this mess here, and we need to figure out solutions to be able to come up with how we usher in the next generation of technology, of energy, of clean energy. Appreciate that. All right, let's transition into our second segment here. We're going to talk about critical minerals, and if we get on board with renewable technologies and energy sources, we need to address the need for critical minerals. Is the race for critical minerals for renewable energy simply repeating the extractive practices of the fossil fuel era? I want to touch on that. We had a very compelling conversation with Eric Lyon. Check that episode out, who's digging into this in multiple books, and then his newest book coming out as well. So wanted to start with Madison here, as this is kind of a space that's really important to you. So when you're thinking about that question that I kind of posed, how do we not repeat our past discretions when it comes to the way that we approach the fossil fuel era when we're thinking about critical minerals? Kind of open us up here and talk about critical minerals as a role in clean energy.
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic, and that's a great way to frame it, that I find myself framing the question in a similar way. Because the energy transition is actively happening and we're actively seeking out these minerals, we do have the opportunity to treat the situation differently than we have in the past. And instead of being reactive in our, after our exploitative or degrading natural resource extraction, we have the opportunity to do better proactively to an extent. I will say that there's already a lot of damage done in mining. There's a lot of unethical, like extremely unethical practices happening around the world, like not exaggerating here, it's slave labor. It's very unethical, and it's pretty repulsive, the way that these resources are extracted. And it's to meet the demand, again, of countries like the US, who are demanding these minerals for our technology, even for our energy transition. And that's why this topic particularly is unique, because you can make the environmental case on both sides of the argument. You can say that resource extraction is environmentally degrading, but you can also say that this resource extraction is necessary to combat climate change, because we need these minerals for a green energy transition. So I'm particularly interested in deep sea mining, because it poses the question, it's even more, in the future, because we're not commercially mining the deep seabed yet. And you can see this argument on both sides of the debate. Environmental activist groups are advocating against deep sea mining for a moratorium, because it could degrade these very, very fragile ecosystems at the bottom of the ocean. But then you can also see the other side of the coin. You can see mining companies, as well as some small island nation states, who are advocating for deep sea mining as a means to address climate change and as a means to grow economically. So it's really interesting, because historically we've kind of seen the argument that, like, oh, if we deforest all these trees, the argument for that is economic development, for industry. And then the argument against it is almost always environmental protection. And those were very divided. But it's a unique argument now, because you can use the environmental take on either side. So that's why it's really interesting. And that's why it's really hard to wrap your head around it sometimes, because it is just very complex. And there's a lot of nuance to these discussions.
Mm-hmm. And Madison, for you, I reference Eric Lyon. One of the things that he talked about was how much of a stranglehold China has on many of these minerals that we are reliant on for our technology and for our renewable energies. How do you think about that as you're US based, and thinking about kind of your own communities and how we have access, or how we're going to kind of go into the future with our strategy around critical minerals? Can you give us just a little bit of a synopsis there of where your thinking is at?
Yeah. I think I saw recently, like maybe 70 to 80% of these critical minerals are processed through China. So yeah, to a lot of people that poses a national security threat, right? Like, how can you be so reliant on any country for a good that's so valuable? But I mean, for me, that just kind of goes to show the complexity of the argument. That's part of the information that mining companies use when they're trying to advocate for deep sea mining, because it would improve that fact. It would diversify our procurement of these minerals. So again, like that's a pro, sure, to a lot of people, but you have to weigh the risk of the potential environmental factors.
Understood. Dr. Kemabonta, Sub-Saharan Africa has been at the center of a lot of this when it comes to the extractive, predatory type practices, of the corporate social responsibility veil that sometimes is laid over some of these initiatives, some of these programs, some of these companies going into these communities, into these countries. And, we've heard from Dr. Nathan Andrews talking about how sometimes governments or militaries will side with these companies over their own people, and things like that are happening in this critical mineral space. I want to get your take on that. How do you see that challenge being laid out in these communities? And do you see opportunity for some agency, some ownership over the future of these minerals when it comes to Sub-Saharan Africa?
I do, but I think that it will require us rethinking the process about what the ownership of these mineral structures look like. And if you think about the idea of extracting and the places where it's mostly like became a problem, where these resources became a curse, for example, these are largely in countries that never really had clearly defined property rights when it came to subsurface minerals. And because of that, the idea was a lot of these minerals are owned by a government, and the government that really, really lacks institutional capacity to fully enforce its ownership on a lot of this minerals, and that leads to conflict across board. I remember a story a friend of mine told me many years ago. He said he was in the boardroom of a major oil firm where his mentor had invited him because they were really thinking through the process of dealing with, oil spills on a lot of their assets across the world, and they wanted to figure out how they can remediate some of the uh, land that might have experienced some spills and things like that. And said they were talking about their assets, for example, in in Europe and in the U.S. and in Africa. And the idea was they had to pay a lot more money, get the remediation tools, hire an environmental engineering company to address some of the problems in Europe and in the US. But when it came to Africa, the idea was, oh, we'll just pay a fee, a fine, sorry. And for some reason, within the room, as he told it to me, was that it was understood what that fine meant, you know, you know, and I'm like, if those countries had taken it more seriously, or if, where the location of the drill sites was, for example, the production site was, belonged to somebody, he's very much more interested in preserving the integrity of the surface of their property. Hence, if you remove oil from the ground, you must remediate, and you must remediate to the state it was before putting removing oil from the ground. And if many of those countries could figure that out, for example, the most best example I could state is creating real private property in subsurface rights. And the second example is, if that is not the case, figuring out a way by which you can improve and increase government capacity to properly enforce its ownership over these assets and be much more incentivized to think about the long-term value of these assets. And when I mean the assets, that is the land, the minerals around. Because after you remove the minerals from the land, if they're solid minerals, you need to fill that space back so you don't have the earth collapse into the ground, so you don't have some of the geological problems that could happen across board, because people still need land to live on, for example. If they can think about that, and I think they can address the problem, and the idea of a resource curse will no longer be a curse. I mean, oil, before oil was discovered in Houston, it was barely a village, but the reason why Houston as a city exists is largely because of oil that has developed the city over time, and many Texas cities can lay claim to these. Dallas, for example. So I would say, thinking about the institutional capacity of these countries, figuring out who really owns the minerals. So instead of getting royalties from removing the minerals, why don't you let the owners of the land get royalties from the subsurface minerals on their land, and then maybe they pay you a tax, and that's how you charge it. That way they are more incentivized to ensure that their land is well taken care of, because it's still their land. And after the oil finishes, or the lithium finishes, or which is the most common case, the cobalt, is utilized, for example, you still want to use that land for other things, right? So hence they have the incentive to require that land uh, to either be put back in the state it was before the mining happened, so they can use it for other things. But if it's some corrupt government entity that is some capital city miles away, no one really has the incentive to come back and think about what has happened to that land. And I think that is a problem that we've seen across the sub-Saharan African region. And this is very much the case with respect to oil, especially the countries that have the major oil exporters in sub-Saharan Africa: Nigeria, Angola, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea. The devastating effects of oil production in those places are largely because there are no subsurface ownership rights in those minerals, and the governments who claim to own those minerals have no incentive to think about what should the post state of that land be in after oil production or mineral production is done. I think if they can if we can start thinking about that approach, and the idea of resources being a curse will no longer be the case. But it's because it's crazy. The resources are very valuable in the markets, super valuable. Why are they then a curse to the countries that we find them in? And we continue to discover that the countries that we find them in, where they're a curse, have no subsurface private, have no property rights and subsurface rights, and the governments who claim to own those assets never really enforce the monitoring and protection of the land after production is done.
I really like that preventative approach of, if we know we have these resources, let's protect them. And then they're not like this boogeyman that we're scared are going to be stolen. Yeah, I really like that.
I think the localizing of that ownership, even beyond the country state level and at the community level, I think is very fascinating to continue to explore, because they do have that incentive for that land beyond its mineral access. So I think that's interesting. Victoria, for you, the story that Dr. Kemabonta mentioned is powerful, because at the boardroom level, there is underrepresentation, if any, from those communities, and so they're just willing to pay the fine, because no more thought needs to be given to those communities. They'll just pay the fine. When you hear that, when you think about that through your own sociopolitical kind of view and lens, how can we bridge that gap? Can we get representation in those boardrooms? Is that a first step? Is that possible? Guide us a little bit.
I mean, I don't want to sound cynical here, but there is something to be said that when people know that you're misbehaving, they will start shaming you, and then that makes you act better. And I say this in a political sense, right? You have a lot of powerful NGOs and movements that have been able to make progress because they've been able to raise awareness about the bad things happening behind the scenes. People get, mad, and they start calling for change. And I think this is why policy is so dependent on the people, right? Because if people are mad about a thing, and you might lose your election if you don't address it, you might be ran out of town because a community is getting fed up with something. A government might not renew your contract as a private organization because they're getting backlash from the international community for these atrocities and human rights violations in your establishment. All these things push government to have to do better. It pushes organizations to have to do better, and companies. And I hate that that's the thing, but I do see it in my own line of work that, blaming and shaming is, sadly, there's a reason it's been the textbook advocacy thing to do for the last at least 20 years. I think Greenpeace built the blueprint, and we've all jumped on it because there is a reason that if people are mad and they see what's happening, they will start doing it. So there's also a misconception in capitalism that as a consumer, we don't have power. But then why do we have all these vegetarian and vegan alternatives to sausages and mincemeat and all this stuff? Well, because companies notice that people want to be veggie, and they're going to give us what we want. So when enough people want it, then they start producing. That's the thing. There is power in you saying that you're mad about something or that you want something, simply because capitalism is catered to give you the thing that you want. And a lot of democratic institutions are also geared to give you what you want. So if you're mad about a thing, they will try to fix it because they don't want to lose the election and their seats and their power. And if you want a certain product, capitalism is going to provide it because they still want your money. So let's ask for good things, because we can get them. But there needs to be a level of shaming and blaming for those things to happen most times.
It's so polarizing what I hear you saying, because many of the tenets of capitalism are potentially the levers that are forcing these circumstances to become the reality that everybody has been mentioning. How do we then take that same system and then flip it to be the lever that allows there to be some change and progress? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that anybody knows the answer to that. Those are really complicated, systemic type questions. That's why we're here. We're here to ask those questions, because I think it's important to look at where the opportunities actually are, because the challenges are very real. They're very palpable. as we look generationally, I think we've had a few generations that we have been poor stewards of the land, so to speak. And now it's falling again on you as leaders to figure out the solutions. And I don't envy you that job. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. I just wanted to acknowledge that for a moment before we go.
Keep us
Yeah, before we go into our third topic and talk about the degrowth dilemma. So a lot of literature says we shouldn't focus on making things, quote, sustainable. We should actually be doing less. Our whole system runs on overconsumption and constant growth. So even if we made everything eco-friendly, we'd still be using way too much. So here's the question. Can degrowth really work? Or are we already too deep into this capitalist, consumer-driven way of life to change course? Touched on that just a little bit. So that's a proper segue there. Victoria, I want to start with you. This is where your mindset and your focus and attention really is. So are we too far down that road? How do we course correct here?
We're never too far down any road, I think, personally, because we have seen things change overnight. And when I say overnight, in politics, overnight is within a week, right? Like things change quite quickly when enough people are mad and motivated enough to change them. I think the problem with degrowth is the same problem we're seeing with renewables and a certain narrative in the international community being said that we need renewables, so we're going to shame people using fossil fuels, right? We can't all decide to do degrowth and then be shocked that poverty is on the rise and there's more diseases and people are, mortality rates are growing and things like that. Degrowth isn't something we can just do. But as we trek back down that road that we've gone down to, if we put global justice at the core, degrowth is focused on reducing excess consumption. So we're not shutting the world down. We're saying, do you actually need all these things? Do you actually need to do all the things that you're doing? Do you need all these resources? Let's scale it back. And then when we scale back, redistribution is essential because you're scaling back excess and redistributing that to where there isn't excess. Because some people cannot go back anymore. They have nothing to go back on, right? So when we redistribute, a lot of it is a conversation about climate reparations, technology transfer, fair trade policies, these types of things that allow us to redistribute the things that we have while having this global solidarity approach. It's not an isolationist policy where we say, okay, degrowth and we're shutting it down and you focus on your thing and I focus on mine and that's how we're going to fix it. Because we are in an international community and there is something to be said about that. So a global solidarity approach that puts global justice at the core focuses on reducing excess consumption and then redistributing those resources that we maybe don't need 1,000 light bulbs in a building. I think that might be a bit excessive.
Mm. When you're speaking, it made me think of one of our guests was Dr. Tom Murphy, who's a physicist who gave Victoria and I a real existential crisis throughout this entire episode. And one of the stories or the kind of metaphors that he gave us was, if the Titanic had had solar panels, it still would have been ripped to shred by that iceberg and sunk. And so I think about that a lot now as I go through my daily life and see the excesses of our current culture and the role that we each play within that. And degrowth seems an impossibility almost to me. And so the decisions that we make within that context are incredibly daunting personally, for any country, for that international community, as you mentioned. So thank you for bringing that kind of to the forefront in this conversation. Madison, I saw you when Victoria said redistribution as something that needs to be understood and addressed. So framing redistribution, talk about that a little bit. How is that something that potentially is impactful or meaningful to you?
Yeah, I think I was definitely nodding because I think redistribution is fundamental to degrowth. Degrowth is not just about decreasing GDP. It's about like radical distribution, radical shifts in the systems that we live in, and also like I have a pretty radical view of degrowth, so I think it means like complete abolition of all like destructive practices. And I like to reference when I'm talking about degrowth a quote from Kate Raworth, who wrote Donut Economics, and she emphasizes that we live on a finite planet, right? Like we're basing our economic system on the foundation of infinite growth on a finite planet. And when we look to nature, the only thing that involves infinite growth is cancer. So if you think about it that way, we're fundamentally contradicting the place that we live by the way that we're living. So I don't really see degrowth as feasible or unfeasible. I more see it as a inevitable eventually. Like I think either the human race continues on uh, with this perception that we can infinitely like extract resources and infinitely grow, or there's like the harsh reality that that doesn't work anymore. And it's a bit grim because it's like either humanity persists in a different way or it doesn't. But I'm thinking way long term into the future here, by the way. I don't know if it would happen in my lifetime, but that's kind of the way that I frame it, as it's inevitable because the world we live on just doesn't support infinite growth.
Yeah, it's back to Dr. Tom Murphy and that conversation. I framed a question where it's like, what time frame do you think in? And it said, 10,000 years. It's, oh, okay. Well, I'm trying to get through the day. I'm trying to get through the week here, and we're thinking about 10,000 years and the impacts that we're having. So, I do want to say he wasn't feeling dire about anything. He said, this is our reality. We just need to be aware of it, and then we need to make choices. And so the choices that, again, the three of you and so many others are making right now are creating the potential and the opportunity for change at a systemic level. All right, Dr. Kemabonta, so I want to come to you with this question of degrowth, and I'm interested, when you're thinking about these communities in sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa, in some of these areas where we have come in time and again and told them, here's the better way to operate your life, here's the better technology, here's the better solution, here's the growth, here's the infrastructure, all these things that you need to be modernized in your way of life and your way of living. And now when we're talking about degrowth, a lot of it's going to be coming back to nature and some of the simple ways that communities have potentially survived and thrived for millennia. And now we need to go back to some of those roots and traditions. Do you see that as an opportunity where we can look to sub-Saharan Africa and the ways that people are living there as potential roadmaps to a better balance? How do you think about that?
Um, it was an interesting conversation, and thank you for mentioning it. Uh, but I would like to the idea of reducing how much we use, because Victoria mentioned something about consumers have power. In economics, there's the idea of consumer sovereignty, as essentially anything that is produced is because somebody's willing to pay for it. And if somebody's not willing to pay for it, it will most likely not be produced. And I think that that should be an important lever that we should use to think about some of the solutions that we want, especially in this concept of degrowth, because it is not a new concept. This Malthusian idea that the world is not enough for all of us. And I think it's this idea of availability bias, because we see things, we also have resource constraints. We don't think that the world or human ingenuity is unique and beautiful in itself to create alternative uses for different types of things that we need. When Malthus proposed this idea, that was the main thing. And even much more recently, Paul Ehrlich, his book on population bomb, where he said by the year 2000 or something that London would be completely ravaged with famine and nobody would be able to eat. For centuries, this idea has been debunked, and it still finds its way in our conversation. The idea that there's going to be resource scarcity and people are going to die and disease is going to take over the world. But when we look at the example of Pearl Ehrlich, where the economist Julian Simon said, let's make a bet. In 10 years' time, every single thing that you said we won't be able to afford will become cheaper, or would have found an alternative for it. And this is exactly what happened. Human ingenuity, the fact that if a resource becomes too expensive, you know, the market will signal that price to, okay, you can't use that resource anymore. Is the idea of the capital value of an asset that's become limited in its availability rises to the roof and nobody can pay for it anymore. Hence, we want to find an alternative use of doing it. That's essentially what the energy transition business is about. The fact that if at some point fossil fuels become impossible to remove from the ground, that price will rise too high. So we need to think about other types of solutions to address it. And that's why it's possible to have solar. That's why it's possible to have wind. Of course, there've been interventions of the production tax credits, feed-in tariffs, and all that. But the idea essentially is that with this wind we have, this solar that we have, the marginal cost is basically zero. Hence, we just want to spend the capital cost and use it for a long period of time, and it has its problems, right? So coming back, bringing this back to Africa, bringing this back to how do we see African countries, for example, develop and what they need. I gave this example some time ago where um, within the same hemisphere, the same hurricane, I believe, ran through, I think, not the same hurricane, but for example, you have Houston, for example, has hurricanes that happens quite a bit, pretty frequently. You know, in the last, I don't know, in the last 7, 6 years, there's probably been 2 or 3 major hurricane events that have taken place. And you see that, okay, there's this billions of dollars of loss in property value, a couple hundred of people die. But within a couple of weeks, everything is fine. Insurance companies have said, paid what they need to pay off. People are okay. But imagine the same event taking place in a place like Mozambique, for example. You know, the people are completely, devastated. The ripple effect that happens over time is disease. I mean, cyclones happen a lot in Mozambique, and we've seen this happen repeatedly. There are almost no insurance structures that can help people out. There are almost no. Now we start to go online and talk about giving aid to these people. Um, if we can think about it this way, I think it's it's incumbent on us to understand the idea of degrowth is maybe not the right way to go. Maybe it is, especially when we look at people who still live in poverty, people who still live in drudgery of the day. Remember, I started this conversation, I said, you can wash your clothes, you can read a book, you can cook your food, and maybe you can even have Siri shop for you at the same time. Your life becomes pretty more efficient. But if you didn't have any of these, you had to spend hours washing your clothes, then stop, then go cook your food, then stop, then go read a book, then stop, then maybe go to the market to buy what you wanted to buy, then stop. Your day is completely used, you're completely exhausted. And to address this, you now have 55 or 60 children so they can help you out in the day. And these children also born into poverty and have to go through this drudgery of getting by the day. I think that if we look at it that we would realize that some of these Malthusian concepts are actually anti-human and anti-human flourishing. And if we think about the idea that people need to live much more effective, much more healthy, much more fruitful lives, so they can have time to do the things that are much more interesting. They can have time to listen to classical music. They can have time to, they can have the privilege of being upset as to why their ketchup doesn't taste as good as the barbecue sauce. And it's a funny thing, but I think it's a real
No,
thing. And if we can think about it that way, I think maybe because I think about solutions that actually help make people's lives better. And if, for example, we realize that maybe that solution has caused, some type of environmental damage or effect down the road, then people stop using it. The idea of consumer sovereignty. If people don't demand it, nobody would make it, because if you can't sell it, what is the point of producing it? The Say's law of production is its own, supply is its own demand. That is pretty. That's, I think, how we should be looking at these things. And in that case, we wouldn't have conversations around, the world is a finite resource. No, we can think about that humans are intuitive. Humans are the ingenuity of humanity is also extreme. Human capacity is also extreme. Maybe we can develop that capacity and figure out alternative ways to do things. And if in the future, living a beautiful life is waking up in a hut, and going to get your coffee because the robots are doing everything else for you. Maybe that's what it is. You don't have to drive to work, you don't have to go through traffic anymore, and you just work out every day, and you just like run and jump and go skydiving for no reason on a Tuesday afternoon. Maybe that's what the future is. But I think that if we can think about the solutions that way, we can think more about human flourishing, and instead of having a much more pessimistic view about human ingenuity to create the better world that we want for ourselves.
Mm. Well, I appreciate the optimistic end cap here to looking at humanity, and now I am even more torn on how dire I feel the situation is, or how optimistic I can be. And again, that's the human reality, and I appreciate this conversation, all three of you, for allowing and forcing somebody like me just to reevaluate and think about the way that I go throughout my life and throughout the world. And I think that's what our audience, that's what anybody out there is hoping to allow the opportunity for those types of decisions to be made so that we can be a part of this thing called humanity. So I appreciate that. And what a great conversation. Really, really good. I got to give a lot of credit to Victoria for pulling this together. It was your idea, Victoria, to have this panel and have it really led by leaders of kind of future generations who are going to be carving the way for us and building a better future. So I appreciate that. Once again, this was Powering the Future, Energy Access, Critical Minerals, and Degrowth Dilemma with Victoria Cornelio, Madison Harris, and Dr. Tam Kemabonta. We appreciate you all for tuning in and hope you all get to make a great decision about the future of our planet and our humanity today. Cheers.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. Appreciate it.
Let's talk power, let's talk change. From rural lights to brighter days. Equity rising, voices strong. We're building tomorrow where we all belong. Tangelic Talks, energy, equity, pride. Empowering the world, side by side. A spark becomes a fire, a vision that's true. Together we rise, it starts with you.